My name is Colin Levings. I'm living in Lions Bay, British Columbia. I first got involved in marine sciences on the west coast of North America when I took a job with the International Pacific Halibut Commission, working in Alaska on a trawl survey. The International Pacific Halibut Commission is a US-Canada outfit based in Seattle. And I was fortunate enough to get a job as a junior technician on a ship working in the Gulf of Alaska. And I was based in with the Halibut Commission from starting in 1962 through to 1963. And the work there included work in the Gulf of Alaska from basically from Cape Spencer right around to Kodiak, and another summer in 1963 in the Bering Sea. So that was my first introduction to oceanography or marine sciences. My area of expertise is quite wide-ranging. I first studied at UBC in fisheries in the Institute of Ocean Sciences, where I worked with Dr. N.J. Wilimowski. I earned my Bachelor of Science there in 1965, and my Master's of Science in UBC in 1968. After working at the biological station in Nanaimo for a year on Pacific cod ecology, I left government and decided to go for my PhD at Dalhousie Oceanography in Halifax. And there I studied benthic organisms, that is the animals living on the bottom of the ocean, at St. Margaret's Bay near Halifax. I guess looking more broadly at the field of the natural sciences on the West Coast, I think we have to acknowledge, first of all, the knowledge, First Nations knowledge of marine organisms. Then Western science actually started with some of the early British and Spanish explorers who were naturalists and recorded in scientific documents what they saw in the way of species all along the coast. The next sort of formal oceanographic studies was not well known. I was one of the first people to discover that it was actually an American expedition on the US Fisheries Commission ship Albatross, which took, as far as I can see, the first oceanographic observations in the Strait of Georgia in 1903. Following that, there was a very expansion of knowledge on the Canadian side, obviously, starting with Reverend Taylor, who established the biological station at Nanaimo. And that time it was under the Biological Board of Canada out of Ottawa. And of course, that was a Canadian, pan-Canadian group with labs in New Brunswick and other places, as well as Nanaimo. That gradually evolved into a much broader organization called the Fisheries Research Board of Canada, which basically ran the biological station as well. The history of oceanography is quite convoluted, really, on the West Coast, with numbers of different agencies involved. For example, the DND, Energy, Mines and Resources, as well as what we, as I mentioned earlier, the Fisheries Research Board, which evolved into what we now know as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Also involved were the lab at UBC Oceanography, which was established in 1949. And from then, there's other universities such as UVic, University of Victoria, and Simon Fraser are now very active in oceanography. It's quite, as I mentioned, it's quite a convoluted and interesting story. And I refer to actually my former professor, Dr. Eric Mills at Dalhousie, who published a paper which gives a very more complete exploration of what happened on the West Coast here in oceanography. When I was starting my career, I was very fortunate to be in contact with number of well-known and very expert scientists in the field. When I was at the biological station working in fisheries, the director was Dr. Peter Larkin, who is a very well-known fisheries biologist. And also at the biological station, I was introduced to Dr. Tim Parsons, a very well-known pioneer biological oceanographer. And also at UBC, Dr. George Piccard, who was a very well-known physical oceanographer, who is very well known for his studies of fjords around the world. So those are some of the people I was very fortunate to have rubbed shoulders with. And when I first started working with fisheries and oceans in 1972, I was hired by Dr. Mike Waldachuk, who is really one of the pioneers of marine pollution research here on the west coast of Canada. He was a physical oceanographer, but also with a very broad interest. And his pioneering work was done with Dr. John Tully, who is also a very well-known oceanographer. And they were some of the first studies on marine pollution, particularly pulp mill pollution, which of course was a big topic in the 50s and even in the 40s. I wanted to mention that BC oceanography is somewhat unique with respect to its place in other parts of the world because of our deep fjords, which place the ocean in direct proximity with the land. And in recent years, there are many good physical oceanographic studies and geological studies tying the land and the sea together, which is called the land-sea interface, and also tying in the climate change related to how ocean temperatures are changing. So this is a rapidly expanding field. There's a number of excellent scientists at UBC and Simon Fraser working on, for example, how fast the glaciers are melting and how that's changing the circulation, the estuarine circulation with the fresh water on the top and the salt water beneath it. As you can imagine, when there's a difference in flows of fresh water, that can change the layering of the estuary, and also results in changes in sediment input into the ocean as more erosion is occurring as the glaciers melt. And all of these more recent studies are built on the classical studies on the fjords done by people like, as I mentioned before, George Piccard, and even further back, Neil Carter in the 1930s, who were really the pioneers in fjord oceanography around the world, of course, tying in with the ones in Norway and also even in South America. So, and also relative to BC oceanography is our continental shelf. We have the deep ocean very, very close to shore. And there's a great deal of interest in things like hydrothermal vents, and which are very unique ecosystems found in the deep ocean operating on the sulfide system. And also the deep ocean seamounts, which are off the west coast, rising to within a couple of 100 meters of the ocean. Also very unique places for the recent oceanographic studies. In the earlier video, I described Ed Ricketts, who is a pioneering American marine ecologist who had some incidental, or not incidental, but some rather important work done in British Columbia. He, for example, one of the voyages he had was on a small launch called the Grampus, and they sailed with some other people, some literary people, actually, and a writer named Joseph Campbell, and also sailing with Ricketts' co-author on his book, John Calvin. So that's why the book is called Ricketts and Calvin. Anyway, they sailed on this small launch from Tacoma up to Sitka, and on their way through British Columbia, they stopped in places like Pender Harbor, at Squirrel Cove, and it's a very interesting trip where some of the sampling that they did in Agamemnon Channel, for example, just north of Pender Harbor, is still used as a baseline study for what the current conditions are. And it's just a very interesting trip where they sampled organisms in Grenville Channel, for example, and eventually went into Southeast Alaska. Well, I guess going back to the first vessel I worked on, I'll just mention in some detail how this story came about. As I mentioned, my first job at sea was in Alaska with the Halibut Commission, and I was this Halibut Commission is a joint U.S.-Canada organization with offices in Seattle. And in the early 60s, there was a concern that the Soviet and Japanese trawlers or fishing boats that haul the net along the bottom, there's a concern that these Soviet and Japanese trawlers were catching too many halibut. Halibut, of course, were caught by Canadian and American ships using long lines, which is a more sort of sustainable way of catching halibut. And so the Halibut Commission had a 3-year charter to trawl in the Gulf of Alaska and try and determine the effects of trawling on halibut, independent of what the Soviets and Japanese were doing. And so the ships were chartered out of Seattle. They had Canadian and American technicians, of which I was hired as one, and we sailed out of Seattle. And I was placed on a vessel called the Western Flyer, which, as it turned out, and I was totally unaware of it at the time that I was in Alaska, this was a vessel that was used by a very well-known marine ecologist, U.S. marine ecologist, whose name is Edward Ricketts, or Edward Flanders Ricketts, commonly known as Ed Ricketts. And he was a good friend of John Steinbeck, the American writer, a well-known American writer. And they had used this vessel on a well-known trip to the Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California, in 1940. And as a result of that 1940 trip, Steinbeck wrote a book called The Log of the Sea of Cortez, which is quite well known and very well read, one of his well-known books. So as a result of this, when I found out that I in fact had perhaps slept in the same bunk as Ed Ricketts, I got quite interested in the vessel and interested in Ricketts. And just to complete what happened with the Western Flyer, after she basically finished her career as a fishing vessel, she sank at the dock in Washington State near Anacortes in the early 2000s, but eventually was raised up from her sunken position. She wasn't sunk that deep, and she was towed over to Port Townsend in Washington State, where she underwent a total rebuild. And as of June 2022, she was totally rebuilt and is refloated, relaunched, and is currently being fitted out for marine ecology with working with students down in California. So I was able to visit the rebuilding process in Port Townsend 2017, and it was very interesting to see how they were doing it. The owner, or the Western Flyer Foundation that is doing it, has spent close to $1 million on building it, and it's really quite an amazing project that they are proceeding with. So as a result of this knowledge of being on the Western Flyer and participating with the rebuilding. I wrote several papers looking at what Ed Ricketts had done on the British Columbia coast in the 30s and 40s. And I discovered that although other people had written on his outer coast work, that is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, he worked around Tofino extensively. I discovered that he also worked extensively in the inner coast around Pender Harbor and Qualicum Beach and Nanaimo, and did a lot of collecting which people didn't know before. So it was interesting to dig into his work on the inner coast and reveal to other people how this early American scientist had contributed to our knowledge. I think the challenges for the future are quite broad, not primarily leading, I think, to the technological changes that have occurred in recent years, things like remote sensing, different mapping techniques of physical and biological and chemical properties in the ocean. As I mentioned earlier, the whole land-ocean interface is very important to understand in British Columbia, as well as the challenges in establishing what's going on with climate change and how changes in the main world ocean, such as what's happening in the Gulf of Alaska, how the currents from the Gulf of Alaska are affecting the BC coast, the effects of El Nino and El Nina, of course, which are affecting our climate as it changes. So we need to have, I think, continued monitoring programs to establish our understanding, as well as conduct basic research on the processes in the ocean and how they're affecting productivity, and making sure that our oceans are kept clean so that they can produce the kind of organisms and maintain the biodiversity that we all cherish on the coast here.